You're listening to the Dibbly-Dobbly podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Henry?
Yeah. Well, hopefully I'm jogging some people's memories about that era. Yep.
Yeah, not so a good time. We now come to the Black Armband Protests in 2003, which I mentioned in the introduction to this interview, was obviously you and Andy Flower making a stand and a protest wearing black armbands in the 2003 Cricket World Cup in that game against Namibia, which was the first game of the tournament for Zimbabwe, to mark the death of democracy in Zimbabwe at the hands of the brutal regime of Robert Mugabe, who's no longer with us. He passed away in 2019. And you and Andy weren't really close as teammates, but you bonded together over this one thing, and you've become very good friends since. Both of you felt very passionate about and strongly about what was happening in the country, and you wanted to take that stand and make that protest, which you did. And I think a couple of years before that, Henry, you wrote a song called Our Zimbabwe, which was to unite the country. And I listened to the song myself. It's quite inspiring. The lyrics and the way it's sung, it makes you feel patriotic, even though I'm not from Zimbabwe, but it's got that feel about it. And I hope that was what you wanted to do in the song and resonate with fellow Zimbabweans as well. I would suggest everyone take a listen to that. Henry has an amazing singing voice, as we know. Obviously, many people weren't happy about the protests. You had some threats about your life in that 2003 World Cup, Zimbabwe secret police. You're hearing someone in the government telling someone that Henry Olonga chap's got something coming towards him or something like that. And that pretty much ended your career. And obviously, Zimbabwe qualified for the next stage for that World Cup, which was in South Africa. And that was your ticket out of Zimbabwe. You couldn't go back after what you did. Announced your retirement from one-day cricket as well. There was some problems. Australia didn't want to play in Zimbabwe, but they did in the end. But England didn't with Nasser Hussain, and that ended a bit ugly. And obviously, you caught up with Nasser Hussain earlier this year when you were there at the Test match at Trent Bridge talking about this. And that was the first time you met Nasser since that day, which was 22 years on. So, Henry, could you walk us through that process and the motivations behind the Black Armband Protest? And now, 22 years on, do you feel the protest achieved the impact or change you would have hoped for at the time? So your thoughts on that?
Well, the first thing I think I would say, and I'm not being one of those people, but I really think that I need to say I cannot do justice to this in a few minutes. And I really highly recommend people do their own research, and if they can, if there's subscribers on Spotify, they could even have a listen to my audiobook, which will probably get me the grand total of about 2 cents for their stream anyway. It's not a lot of money that I'll get, so I'm not trying to strong arm people into doing it. But we put a lot of thought into the audiobook, and I detail with exacting accuracy, blow by blow, how it all unfolded. But I'll try and be brief. So, round about the late 90s, Zimbabwe had political upheaval because the nation as a whole was starting to get a little weary of Robert Mugabe's rule. And there was a new political party that came to the fore called the Movement for Democratic Change. It was run by a man called Morgan Tsvangirai. And he would become an opponent of Mugabe's for the next maybe decade and a bit. But during that time, one of the things he did was he galvanized the people of Zimbabwe to effectively oppose a referendum in which Robert Mugabe would be allowed to change the constitution in the country. And so a lot of urbanites decided to side with the MDC, and the vote was overthrown, and Robert Mugabe was maybe perhaps somewhat humiliated, I don't know. But for the first time, he didn't get his way. And, he was a dictator. So he was in power for 37 years. And that was the first time he wanted something and he couldn't get it. Well, this resulted in a backlash to not only the MDC, but also to people whom the government perceived were supporting the movement for democratic change, which were mainly white farmers. Now, there's some historical context to all of this. There's the fact that Zimbabwe used to be Rhodesia, it used to be a British colony. There was a war which lasted for a number of years in the 70s, which enabled Zimbabwe to become a thing. Prior to that, it was Rhodesia. In the mid-50s, I think, or 60s, a man called Ian Smith declared unilateral declaration from independence from Britain. And gosh, if I'm right, I think it feels to me like it was the 60s, so like mid-60s. Anyway, and that really was one of the catalysts for the Civil War, which happened in the 60s and 70s and lasted a decade or so. And Mugabe and many of his supporters were thrown in prison, incarcerated for much of that war. Anyway, he comes out and he's the first leader Zimbabwe's given. He was voted in by a landslide, and unfortunately, there were stories of voter intimidation and violence even in the first election. But anyway, he became the father of the nation, if you will, and many were surprised that he beat a man called Joshua Nkomo, who others labeled as the father of the nation. But Mugabe became the leader, and over those years, so say for the first decade and a bit, the country just continued to function. People didn't ruffle feathers. There was a dissident problem in the early 80s, and Mugabe sent his army to go and find the dissidents. But unfortunately, the army committed atrocities and murdered almost 30,000 people at least, and up to maybe 100,000 people. And so there were red flags along the way that Mugabe was a ruthless leader who would use violence to get his way. So anyway, cutting a long story short, fast forward back to 98, 99, 2000, Mugabe allowed so-called war veterans to go and invade the land that they argued had been stolen from them, and they wanted to take it back. I guess that could be the kind of argument that Australians might understand. Like if the indigenous people of Australia decided that they wanted to rise up and confiscate land from, white settlers because that land was stolen from them thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago, whatever the case may be. That kind of gives you an analogy of what the sentiment was at the time. So Andy Flower had a friend called Nigel Huff, whose farm got taken over. And let me just say, it was a very tumultuous time. Lots of people died. I'm talking about that period of time with the land invasions, as they were called, the farm invasion. Many people lost their jobs. A lot of black farmers were displaced. But anyway, cutting a long story short, Andy came to me one day saying that he felt what was going on needed to be challenged, and a friend of his lost his farm, a man called Nigel Huff, and he backed some kind of protest at the World Cup of 2003. And he felt that a boycott, a total boycott, was the way to go. Now, Andy spoke to me, and I'd already come to the same place myself because I was tired of the corruption. I'd written that song, I was Zimbabwe. I was working with a charity for orphans. And so I was just starting to get mad at the corruption and the mismanagement of the country and the high taxes I was paying and seeing very little for it. And so I was ripe and ready to do something. And cutting a long story short, in the end, Andy Flower and I decided we would just limit the protest to the two of us. We ended up deciding it was going to be a Black Armband Protest and also writing a statement. Now, there are other players involved in the protest, people who helped us write the statement, people who we consulted with about security. We picked many brains before we did it. A journalist that helped us getting the statements out, Jeffrey Dean, for example. So there was a lot of stuff that happened in the background that I just don't have time to talk about now. But ultimately, as you mentioned, it was the first match that Zimbabwe played in the World Cup 2003. We played it in Harare at the sports club, and it changed my life. Long story short, it wasn't long before I was dropped from the side. Then I got death threats. And then I had to flee the country and ended up in exile in England, where I started a new life. And I'm now in Australia, of course, but I lived for 12 years in England. I fled there. I was shown kindness by so many people who helped me escape. And remember that trip I made in '96 to work with Dennis Lilly here in Adelaide? Well, it so happens that I met my wife on that trip. We stayed friends for many years, just long distance sort of pen pal type friends. And then, well, in 2004, we got married. And then we started a family in 2010. And 5 years later, she wanted to come home. And so we came. And so we've been here for a number of years now. It's 10 years now since we settled in Oz. We live in Adelaide. It's a lovely place. You know, it's not complicated. Life is very simple here in a good way. And kids are settled in school, and we just get on with it. Of course, I've got half an eye on what's happening in Zimbabwe, and in the world of cricket over there. They've had a tough old time in the last few months. They're playing a lot of cricket this year. I think they're playing 11 tests or 12 tests in the year, something like a calendar year. It's going to be a very tough time for them, especially if they're playing top flight opposition. And so, if I'm not mistaken, they played against England, got beaten in that one-off test, and they played against South Africa, then they played against New Zealand, and did they just play Sri Lanka in a test match as well, test series as well? They certainly played them in one day. But anyway, listen, this train is going to roll on, and they got more cricket to come, and I think that's a good thing. But I think at some point they've obviously got to start succeeding against good opposition. Otherwise, the calls for a two-tier system will grow ever louder. And if another Mulder comes along and takes Lara's record, obviously there'll be serious questions asked about the quality of the team. Should they be playing against the top flight in cricket? And I think it would be a shame if they don't play against the good sides. But they'll need to start, putting the numbers on the board now. They'll need to start scoring good runs and bowling sides out, and then becoming competitive.
Yeah, definitely. Just one more question before we move on, Henry. Politics and sport. People say they shouldn't mix, but on the odd occasion they do. And we've seen many players, obviously like yourself and Andy, as we've talked about, 2003 Black Armband Protest. We've seen quite a few more players make protests or release statements about things that concern them in terms of their own beliefs and what they think is right. Do you think that players should have that right to express what they express about things in the world? Or do you think this is from an athlete or a cricketer or a sporting person? Or do you think should focus on the sporting side of things because many people don't care about politics or other stuff? They just want you to go out there and do your thing. They don't really care about what you're championing or what you believe strongly in. But I suppose people will relate to that from their sporting heroes and make them think about these things. And I'm sure that's what you did with Andy at the time when you did the protest, to make people think about these things a bit better. So your thoughts on that, Henry?
Okay, well, I'll try and be brief, but first thing I'll say is, as a sportsman or a sportswoman, you obviously have personal feelings about things. And I think if we live in a world where you're free to express personal opinions, then you should be able to do that in your personal capacity. The complication is you are an ambassador of your country and you represent, I guess, the highest ideals of your country. As a sports person, you shouldn't really be getting involved in frivolous things. I mean, if you literally have a high commissioner in another country, doing things that are unbecoming of a high commissioner, you'd probably call them back, wouldn't you? Or her back. Could be a woman, couldn't it? But, if you've got a high commissioner, say, representing Australia in in a country like Ibiza. Not that you'd be in Ibiza, but every week they're partying and saying inappropriate things on social media and, swearing in front of the cameras. You'd probably say, I don't think you're cut for this, buddy or lady, because there's an expected level of decorum that's expected from someone in that position. So now we've got to mix these two worlds. Back in my day, we did not have social media, so we did not have a social media code of conduct. We did not have anything to say, you can't talk about this issue or that issue. But we also didn't have a playbook on what you do when your country is run by a dictator who's a murderer and has murdered 30,000 plus people. And what do you do in a country like that? Do you stay silent? Do you speak out? Do you just play the sport and mind your own business? And I don't know. It's a dilemma, isn't it? Like let's think back to maybe 80 odd years ago when a man called Adolf Hitler was doing his thing around the world and people were just following orders, right? Most of us look back and think, how dare people just go along with it just because it wasn't the right thing to do to stand up to authority, right? Most people will think in an abnormal society like Zimbabwe was at the time, it's okay, justifiable, in my humble opinion, to do abnormal things, to have attention brought to a situation. And it's quite sad that it was kind of left to sports people and journalists and lawyers and the rest of the world, the real politicians in the world, just kept quiet. They didn't want to rock the boat. And Robert Mugabe was a firebrand. He would call the West out on its hypocrisy. And so the minute they tried to tell him to get his house in order, he would say, "Oh, but you guys invaded Iraq illegally," and they'd shut up. So it was kind of almost left to people who didn't have mud or dirt or blood on their hands to speak out against big power. And you need to speak out against big power. We need people like that in this world. Otherwise, big power abuses its power. It just does. I wasn't looking for the fight. I just wanted to play cricket. I just wanted to bowl and do well for my country. But, my poor fellow countrymen being smashed up by the police or the army and losing their homes and, corruption is stealing their salaries. And it was just a very, very bizarre time, if I'm honest. And it's not something I'd ever do again because I don't think I'll ever come across those conditions in my life. But you know what I've got, Jack? I've got, I guess, the satisfaction of knowing that in a time of great distress in Zimbabwe, I stood up and did something. I don't care whether politics and sports should mix or shouldn't. I really don't. I know that real people lost their lives because a leader who had a big ego could just snap his fingers and they were gone. And I'm glad I spoke up. I'm glad I said something. It's not a life calling for me to just constantly harass politicians. But, that's why we have a free press in the world, is to hold big power to account, isn't it? That's what voices, even if they're lone voices in the world of sports, are there for. Now, in recent times, we've had some people attempt to do protests. We've had Usman Khawaja, speaking out and trying to do symbolic protests, and the ICC have clamped down on it. So I think they've learned their lesson. They won't allow it now. But back then, it was a different time. Back then, we hardly had a free press. There was one newspaper in the country in Zimbabwe. There wasn't much in the way of a way to express yourself on a large scale. And so Aniplau and I did that. And, other sportsmen have expressed their political opinions, on the sporting field. But, it's hardly the biggest scandal in cricket. We've had match fixing, we've had spot fixing happen. There have been scandals revolving around financial impropriety at the highest levels in some boards. We've had some serious scandals and a couple of players wearing a black armband and saying a few words that might hurt a few people, asking the powers that be in their countries to try and be nicer, I think is hardly the worst thing in the world that you can do. But according to some people in Zimbabwe, I was a traitor. I dishonored my country and I deserve to die. Now, we're doing this podcast just a day or so after a man was assassinated in America for speaking his mind. I don't want to speak into that. I'm just saying, isn't it a crazy world if people threaten to kill you just because you open your mouth for words, Jack? For words, for writing nice, encouraging words to implore someone who's powerful to do a little better. That can get you killed. To me, that's insane.
Yes, that's very true, Henry, and it does make you think, ponder about these things, things that do affect us on a day-to-day basis in our lives, and it's
And of course,
one of
one more thing, if I may add, Robert Mugabe was a patron of Zimbabwe cricket for all the years that I was there for. Like, who brought politics into sport then? Like, he literally would come down to the matches and shake hands with players from other countries. Doesn't happen in every country, but it happened in Zimbabwe. Yeah, and Zimbabwe and the ICC were terrified to say anything. They said, "Oh, we're an apolitical organization. We don't involve politics in sport." But then, there were pictures of Modi and Albanese rocking up to a test match in India, driving around in the open top car. I mean, like, the pollies are very comfortable around sports people. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's fashionable for them to be seen around sports. And so it's weird to me that people just apply it when they think it should be applied. Sports and politics shouldn't mix. Yeah, but one of the reasons sport does so well in Australia is because the sporting bodies actually put money into it. The sports commissions and the sporting bodies, they invest, they give grants to promising kids, they give scholarships. So sports and politics are intertwined. It just gets ugly when it confronts us in real life. We just don't like it invading our space when it's talking about real issues in life. Because for most people, unfortunately, sport is about entertainment. They just want to leave the game feeling happy that their team won. They don't want to be confronted with the news at the end of the day that talks about the financials, and it talks about war in this region of the world, or drought, or death, or a tornado, or a tsunami. And I totally get it. Sport, in many ways, is an escape for people, and it's also the bastion of patriotism for others, because we don't fight real wars anymore. You know what I mean? We sort of do, but we don't. Like, we don't go and invade another country to show our dominance over them. So we try and do it on the sports field. And so I understand it's tight, it's sort of interwoven with nationhood and a sense of belonging and who you are. People wear sports teams, they wear the caps, they buy the paraphernalia. And so I get it. I get it. But all I'll say is, back in the day, Zimbabwe was a very abnormal place, and for people to have stayed silent would have been inhumane and a travesty. And even today, if there's suffering in the world and someone wants to speak out against it, I won't begrudge that person, Usman Tawaja, whoever. If he loses his career over it, and that's the price he's willing to pay, more power to him. But I personally empathize with anyone who has a platform and wants to use the platform to speak up against big power.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing your thoughts there, Henry, on that, and taking us back to that day in Harare with you and Andy Flower and doing that Black Armband Protest in 2003.
And if I may add one more thing, it's like most people will rightly question, who the heck are you? And I would say, yes, who the heck am I? I was just a little cricketer. I'll never be celebrated as a great anything. But, most sports people will promote any political or social issues that the cricket board promote or support. So, if for example, the cricket authorities want to get behind Jane McGrath during the Pink Test and the Jane McGrath Foundation, or the McGrath Foundation want to raise money, that's absolutely fine. If it was slightly political, people wouldn't be happy. And I don't understand that. I really don't. Like, politics probably affects your life more than the nice feelings you get from, your team winning. And so I do find it just a little weird that people can be so strongly opposed to the idea that in extraordinary circumstances, people are allowed to speak out. Having said that, as a sports lover myself, I don't know that I'd want every match or every sporting event to disintegrate into some kind of statement or some kind of protest either. So I can see both sides, but I'm biased because I'm someone who was an activist at one point in my life, and I'm biased towards that side. But I totally understand the people who turn around and say, you know what, they shouldn't mix. Just go and do your politics there, and we'll do our sport here. Leave us alone.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sum that up, Henry. And then thanks again for sharing that with us. Hi everyone, hope you enjoyed hearing Henry and I discuss the Black Armband Protest.